So they asked me to talk a little bit about skeletal anatomy and physiology, and I didn't think about it as much when I was working here in Wisconsin, because I worked mostly with layers. But now that I'm in Minnesota, I'm dealing a lot more with broilers and turkeys, and the leg strength of those birds becomes much more of a factor. And if you're raising pheasants, certainly the leg and wing strength of those birds is extremely important for performance. So what I'm going to touch on briefly, I think I'm just going to touch on the first three topics so we get done at 11:15. Number 4 is already in your notes. Unique features of avian bone, the avian anatomy, and how does bone grow? And why is that so important when we're raising birds at that early age? First of all, anybody who goes into avian work is struggling to answer that the primary question: why does the chicken cross the road? And many experts have come up with answers to this. For example, Albert Einstein questions whether you are moving over, or the chicken is moving over the road, or the road is moving under the chicken. It's all relative. So how does the avian skeleton differ from mammals? There's a lot, some of the ornithologists, if there's any ornithologists here, they'll probably shoot me, but from what I've seen from the literature, 3 primary differences. One, birds have much more fusion of the bones in their body to consolidate them for flight, particularly along the vertebral column, in the wings, and the feet as well. They have a reduced bone mass for body weight, and that makes sense. You think, why does a bird fly? Because it's trying to be lighter in weight. But what research has discovered as well, that actually if you look at the bone of the bird compared to mammals of a similar size, say if you compare a rat with a pigeon or something like that, similar body weights, the bone of the bird is actually denser. They've just done that by water mass, evaluating the ability of the bone to displace water. And so, in other words, that bone is stronger per cubic millimeter compared to rodent bone, for example. And finally, birds have air channels in their bone, and that's referred to as pneumatic bone. And those are extensions of the respiratory tract, the air sacs which are inside the body cavity of the bird. And in essence, that also helps to lighten the weight of that bone. Here's an example of pneumatic bone. This is a bone from the vertebral column. And if you look at this section right here, that should be the pointer, all these spaces in there, you don't normally see that in the bones of mammals. So all of these are air channels, and there's all these trusses, these little spicules of bone, which help to support and strengthen that bone, but it is lighter than what you would see with the bone from a dog, cat, or whatever. So what does the skeletal system do? Some of these may appear very obvious to you. It protects the internal organs. I was in a bicycling accident, road biking, about 3 years ago. Kind of cradled my bike going about 10 miles an hour, landed and shattered my elbow and broke my ankle. My internal organs were fine. I didn't suffer any neurologic damage. And when the ambulance picked me up, he said there wasn't a scratch on the bike. So so my skeletal system protected not only my bike, but my internal organs. And so that's really is a basic function of the skeletal system. The skeletal system is an important source of minerals, particularly calcium, for ionized calcium for the bloodstream, for egg production. And I should mention here in this photograph here, this is a cross-section of a vertebral column of a broiler chicken. And this just shows the spinal cord being encased within that spinal canal. So again, very important protective function. And of course, the skeletal system provides a mechanism allowing for movement, whether that movement is walking or flight as we deal with birds. And also, within the marrow of the bone are the blood-forming elements, the stem cells that make our peripheral red cells and our leukocytes, inflammatory cells as well. Bone is primarily made up of mineral. Up to 65% of it in a mature bird is mineral, primarily calcium and phosphorus in the form of hydroxyapatite. We have a liquid digester at the Minnesota lab that instead of incinerating carcasses after we perform a necropsy, we put them in the liquid digester. It kills bacteria, viruses, and prions. It can take a 2,600-pound bull, and in 3 hours in a sodium hydroxide solution and under pressure, after 3 hours, that bull, you have nothing but bone. But you pick up that bone, you can pick up a soup bone from that bull and just crush it in your hands. It's virtually all mineral at that point because the protein has been taken out of it. So it's that mineral that provides the hardness, but it's the organic matrix, the collagen, which holds it all together and gives it that flexibility. 35% organic matrix, that's kind of an exaggeration because about 10% of that would be water as well. So I'd say probably it's closer to 20-25% of that bone would be protein or collagen. I don't have any skeletons of pheasants, but pheasants are galliforms or in the gallinaceous family of birds, and these are the birds that make us money. You know, you look at everything here, there's an industry for virtually all the birds I have listed here: chicken, turkey, pheasant, partridge, peafowl, quail, grouse. Generally heavy-bodied birds that don't fly long distances, so they have shorter, rounded wings. They tend to be ground dwellers, and because of that, they have very well-developed legs. So when I'm showing photographs, it's either going to be photographs of either the chicken skeleton or the turkey skeleton. And there's two primary parts to the skeleton: the center skeletal region, the axial skeleton, which starts with the skull and the associated vertebral column, the ribs that attach the vertebral column to the sternum. And we also have the appendicular skeleton, the wings and the legs, and the girdles that hold those wings and legs to the body. Let's start with the skull. Unlike most mammals, there are multiple moving parts to the beak that allow it to open a little bit larger when the bird gapes its mouth. And that likely is a carryover from the reptilian ancestors that these birds have. And you'll notice a couple other things about the skull. If you look through the nares, it goes from one side to another. Of course, you're familiar with that because it makes it very easy to place the specula in the nasal cavity of those birds. There's no bone. Whoops, there's no bone underneath the eye. We have sinuses, and our sinuses are encased in bone, and when they're infected, they hurt like the devil. In birds, when they have sinus infections, because there's no bone right here, you see the swelling right there. I'm sure none of you in this room have ever seen anything like this in your birds because of your exquisite husbandry. As you know, birds do not have teeth. I just learned recently that birds do have genes that encode for teeth, but they're never expressed, and likely they represent rudimentary genes from their reptilian ancestors many, many years ago. Vertebral rigidity for flight. We're going to break down some parts of the axial skeleton here. The main point I want to make here is that many segments of the vertebral column are fused to form a very stiff rod. So you're actually sitting here in the belly of the bird looking up at the vertebral column. These are fused, and so it forms a nice stiff foundation to support the wings of the bird. So fused thoracic and fused lumbar vertebrae. They also have a pygostyle, which is the fused tailbone of the bird. And significance of that, it's where the wing, the tail feathers are attached. Not very significant in most of the gallinaceous birds. However, for example, woodpeckers, they have a very large one, because if everyone has seen a woodpecker hopping along a tree, they use that tail to balance them as they're hopping up and down, so it's much larger, broader based for the feathers. The thoracic cage, and that includes the ribs, the sternum, and the vertebral column. And one interesting thing about birds is that not only do they have the ribs, which I have outlined in red here, and the ribs attach the sternum to the vertebral column, they also have these little slips of bone that are called uncinate processes, and those are attached. Those attach one rib to the other, and it further strengthens that vertebral or that thoracic cage. And again, helps protect the internal organs, maintains respiration, and certainly stabilizes the bird for flight. The sternum or keel bone, you get a variety of different keel bones in many types of birds. This is standard for the galliforms, and that's where the breast muscles attach. Why did the chicken cross the road? To take jobs away from hard-working Americans. Pat Buchanan, conservative commenter and former presidential candidate. So, we're now going to the appendicular skeleton. These are the wings and the legs. And the girdle for the wings, there's a set of 3 bones, the clavicle or wishbone, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's also referred to as the furcula. And that meets up at what I call the shoulder joint with a very broad bone called the coracoid, and that attaches to the sternum. There's also a scapula, just like we have a scapula heading back over the back of the bird. And they meet together to form, it's almost a tripod here, which are attached and form stability for that wing. Now, where those bones attach, the clavicle, the coracoid, and the scapula, there's a little hole there. The foramen triosium, it's a hole formed by 3 bones. And the significance of that is certainly important for flight of the birds because there's 2 slivers of breast muscle. The largest breast muscle is the pectoral muscle. That attaches to the femur and it pulls on the wing so that it goes down. The foramen triosium, where these 3 bones come together, the tendon of the deep pectoral muscle or the supracoracoideus, it attaches on top and it raises that wing. So those muscles, there's 2 muscles on that breast muscle that will allow that wing to go up and down. And this is the most delicious part of the bird as far as I'm concerned. The pelvic girdle consists of pelvic bones very similar to what we see in humans. The major difference is that those pelvic bones are not fused underneath. And I'll show you a photograph of that in just a moment. So the leg muscles, the leg bones consist of the femur, which attaches at the hip joint. There's a stifle or knee joint, just like we have, a patella. And yes, these birds have cranial and caudal cruciate ligaments, just like our athletes do who rip them up in sporting events or on ski trips. The tibiotarsus, otherwise known as the drumstick, at least to me anyway. So in birds, the pubic bones are not fused. Particularly, obviously, I think an evolutionary change for a bird that's constantly passing an egg out through that channel, those pubic bones are not fused. Generally speaking, in a laying chicken, those bones are about 3 fingers length between each other if that bird is laying. And I don't handle a lot of live breeders, but some of the breeder pheasants that I've necropsied, it's usually about 2 fingers or so, certainly much smaller eggs than you get from a laying hen. But the egg is going to be passing right through that space. Anyone who has gone to Buffalo Wild Wings or BW3s and enjoys their wings out is well familiar with what I'm showing you here. The humerus, which attaches at the shoulder joint, the ulna and the radius. And I talked about the fusion of the bones in these birds. So unlike, for example, my hand, which has a multitude of carpal bones and then bones extending from it, in the bird, those are all fused together. And again, I think it creates a more rigid structure suitable for flight. The primary feathers extend from the carpal metacarpus, and the secondary feathers actually insert on the bone of the radius. This is the allula here. I refer to it as the thumb of the bird. Sometimes if you're trying to minimize flight, in a bird, in a zoo type situation, you can actually cut that alula off, and it will at least make it difficult for that bird to fly long distances. The legs, I mentioned this already, the femur, the tibiotarsus, and the tarsometatarsus. And again, I'll emphasize that this is a fusion of bones, somewhat different than what we will see in mammals. The feet of the bird. Birds are toe walkers. They certainly walk much different than we do. This is actually the hock of the human foot, and all the pressure is placed on this entire distance, whereas in the bird, the hock is up here, and they're just walking on the ends of their digits. How does a bone grow? Extremely important during the early period of time, and this is where we can run into problems with chicks. Bone's going to grow in two directions, actually three directions. There's going to be a growth plate at either end, and the growth plate, I'll explain it in a moment. The shaft or the diaphysis of the bone, and so that bone is going to grow thicker over time because it's going to be growing out in this direction on either side, and it's going to be growing in a longitudinal direction. If we take that shaft and we cut it in half, there's a broad circle of bone. It's called the cortex. On the surface of that cortex is a periosteum and also bone-producing cells. And so they deposit bone on that periosteum and allow that bone to grow larger. This is the marrow center right here. It's a very dynamic process, bones being removed and deposited at the same time. So how does a bone get longer? Essentially at the growth plate, which is a layer of growing cartilage, and that growth will stop when the bird matures. The bird is producing layers of chondrocytes, cartilage cells. It just layer upon layer. And those chondrocytes at this zone here, they are eaten up and they're converted to bone. And what you see in the red is a stain for bone. It's staining the mineral in bone. So the chondrocytes, they grow this way. Bone is deposited, and the bone grows this direction. So you get, in the mature bird, an elongation of that bone. To me, this tells it even more. This is from a broiler, day 4 to day 32. An incredible change in the drumstick of that bird over a 4-week period. It demonstrates the rapid growth rate of that bird, and also the problems that can arise if there's anything that interferes with the metabolism of that bone or any damage to that bone over that period. Bone mineral. I've done some work with broilers, and I know Dr. Knoll has an extensive experience with looking at bone ash in birds, and that relates to the amount of mineral that's in the bone. So birds very young are going to have about a 50% bone ash by dry weight, but as they mature, they're going to get up to 60 to 65%, which is in an adult bird. That's where you would expect the bird to be. I apologize. For some reason, I was really into 18 days, and I showed that data twice. But I'm just trying to demonstrate there's just a progressive rise in the amount of mineral in that bone. And when the bird reaches maturity, it will just level right out. Why did the chicken cross the road? Grandpa says, in my day, we didn't ask such silly questions. Someone told us the chicken crossed the road, and that was good enough for us. So mind your own business. I'll speak very briefly about a couple disorders that I've encountered in game birds, and one is splay leg. I think everyone dealing with chicks has dealt with chicks from one time or another have had an abnormal growth of the leg. It could be a developmental abnormality, or it could be an abnormality related to the husbandry, whether the environment is too slick, or where there was a problem with the nutrition of the birds that affected the growth of that bone. Whoops, what am I doing to this? And it usually affects a few birds in the flock. If you have a genetic disorder, the chances are that there's going to be a much greater percentage of those birds that can be affected. And one thing that happens, if that leg starts to grow out abnormally, the hock tendon or the gastrocnemius tendon slips out of the leg. So we often call that slip tendon. And it's really not a disease of the tendon, it's a disease of the bone that's growing abnormally, and the tendon pops out of that bone. Here's an example. Let's start with the normal. There's a ridge in the back of the hock that tendon fits into. But if that bone starts to rotate, that tendon can pop right out of that ridge, and that's usually what people will see and what we refer to as slip tendon. So what did we have in these birds? And actually what we had, the amount of mineral in the bone, all that, histologically things were normal. The bone was just abnormally shaped. So here's a normal bird here, and here you can see the end of the shaft of this bone is bent at an angle. And also, if you look on the top of the bone, it's slightly rotated. And once we get birds in like this, a lot of bone disorders, once it's like this, there's just nothing that we can do. I mean, these birds are goners. And which is why I emphasize in terms of trying to identify these leg abnormalities as early as possible to determine whether you can address, is it nutritional, does it deal with the quality of the husbandry related to litter quality, dry and secure footing in the house, is it anything related to the breeder traits or genetics? Certainly, I would suggest looking at the general husbandry in the house and the quality of the feed that those birds are getting first. And speaking of quality of feed, last thing I'm going to mention is osteomalacia. I've seen osteomalacia in game birds. Usually it's young game birds, and for young we usually use the term rickets. There's not enough mineral getting into the bone. We see it in all types of birds. If you see rickets in a young flock, and if you can do it, usually the best thing you can do right away, you want to get that feed analyzed, but most importantly, just get in some new feed right away and see if you can supplement those birds. Because as I demonstrated when I showed you that drumstick, how rapidly that drumstick will grow, it doesn't grow as rapidly in game birds as it does in broilers, for example, but those young birds are growing extremely fast. And if you cannot correct that abnormality in the bone rapidly, those birds are always going to lag behind what their expected normal would be. So addressing that problem as quickly as possible is the best way to go. Low vitamin D3 in the ration. Vitamin D3 can deteriorate under conditions of high temperature and moisture. So if the feed's been sitting too long, you may be deficient in, there may be a deficiency of vitamin D3 in the ration. So calcium, phosphorus, vitamin D3 are the best things to look at when you're dealing with rickets. We see more rickets in laying hens. Why? Because they're putting considerable percentage of their bone calcium each day into producing an egg. And if that's not replenished, they can easily be down 10 to 20% of their bone calcium in a matter of a week. This is a ricketic broiler chicken. Again, these birds are bright and alert, but they just cannot support their body because they do not have enough strength in their bone. And how do I know there's not enough strength in the bone? You start to see things like this. There's no way on a live bird that you should be able to take that shaft and bend it in half. And there's no way that a normal bird should have a rubber beak like that. Okay? Some very obvious things. And as a pathologist, I can see beating of the ribs on a necropsy. These lesions here, the ribs are twice as thick as they need to be, and there's a lot more collagen in them than one would expect to see. So, monitor the ration, change feed immediately if you think there could be a ricketic situation. It doesn't mean you throw the feed away, but particularly with young birds, if you have the opportunity to do that, you can get it analyzed and you can see if everything's proper, and then perhaps you could reuse it or use it for another purpose. Have it analyzed for calcium, phosphorus, vitamin D, protein level. In some instances, you might be able to supplement with dicalcium phosphate. Adding a water-soluble vitamin D to the drinking water can be very effective in an emergency situation. And finally, in Wisconsin, on the weekends, I like to show this whenever I'm in town. Look out for these types of birds. These are the most dangerous birds you will find out on the highways.